Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is a show where we bring you the latest political updates happening all around the continent of Africa. I am Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I am Rita, Omodia. And on today's episode, we'll be looking at Tunisia and Senegal elections. They had their local government elections yesterday, and we saw lots of people come out to vote their proposed people who want to represent them at the local affairs. And this has been something that a lot of Senegalese have been waiting for.
Oh, yes. And interesting updates on the continent. Of course, everybody's radar is on Burkina Faso. Definitely. And we're monitoring the fast development situation there. Yeah,
so far we know that the president, that's Christian Aborowa, has been detained by the military. We also know that the state TV is also being controlled by the military, though still operational. And there are signs that a coup has once again occurred in Burkina Faso. But we'll wait to see how this happens. Now, we start with today's topic. Now, we look at Tunisia. Tunisia has been in a state of political crisis since last July 25, when the president Saied began to take the exceptional measures of freezing the powers of parliament, lifting parliamentary immunity, abolishing the body established to monitor the constitutionality of laws, issuing legislation by presidential decrees, dismissing the prime minister and appointing a female prime minister to form a new government. Civil society groups and Said's political opponents have expressed fears of a return to authoritarianism and the only democracy to have emerged from the Arab Spring protests over a decade ago.
Meanwhile, it's another election year, and to kick-start elections in Africa for the year 2022, voters in Senegal went to the polls on Sunday, January 23rd, to elect mayors and local representatives in a vote seen as a key test of support for President Macky Sall. The poll, which comes 5 months ahead of an eagerly awaited general election, is also the first since Sall won a second term in 2019 and was postponed 3 times. These questions come to the front burner.
Well, Senegal's local elections create a clean slate for presidential parliamentary elections or a litmus test for the president.
And in Tunisia, who will the balance of power sway to? Can Tunisia's leaders forge a new democratic bargain? Will there be light at the end of the tunnel? The conversation starts now.
اليوم في تونس مضمونة أكثر من أي وقت مضى، ونحن نسعى إلى تطبيق القانون على الجميع. أقول أننا لا نريد العنف ونرفض العنف ونرفض أي تجاوز من أي كان.
شفنا نهار 14 جانفي انه تم غلق كل الشوارع وتم حرمان المواطنين من حقهم في التظاهر وفي الاحتجاج. تم ضرب المتظاهرين بعنف، اعتداءات عنيفه كانت جدا على المتظاهرين. تم ايقاف عشرات المتظاهرين وفيهم حتى اليوم مازال شكون موقوف، مع الاقل 6 من المحتجين ما زالوا موقوفين الى اليوم. تم الاعتداء ايضا على عدد كبير من الصحفيين والمصورين توانسه واجانب، تم الاعتداء عليهم بعنف شديد، وثم شكون تم نددنا به وطلبنا انه رئاسه الجمهوريه تحقق وتحاسب كل الذين تسببوا في انتهاكات وتعتذر للمواطنين، وخاصه حذرنا من انه تواصل الانتهاكات هذه وتواصل ضرب حريه الصحافه وحريه التعبير وحق التظاهر وحق الاحتجاج. احنا نشوفوا انه الوضع توا خطير ولا يمكن ان يتواصل هذا الوضع في قادم الايام، لانه كما قلت سيزيد من الاحتقان وسيزيد من الانقسام في الشارع. لذلك انا نقول انه على السلطه القائمه ان يكون لها خطاب واضح وخطاب صريح.
Now, joining us on the conversation today is Fadil Al-Azira, who is a journalist, a researcher, and editor. Thanks for joining us on the conversation, Fadil.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Just last weekend, President Saied was on the phone call with his French counterpart, President Emmanuel Macron, and he made assurances that guarantees Tunisia's freedoms. What do you make of this latest assurance?
Well, of course, he's trying to assure international community. We've seen international actors specifically being very vocal about what they see as with their concerns about Tunisia perhaps increasing repression since July 25th. Certainly, they've more voiced their concerns about what we've seen as the freezing of parliamentary democracy and powers going to the presidency instead, without a clear understanding of where things are going. The president, when he made his announcement last July, suspending parliament, he had initially suggested that it was a temporary measure. And he actually got quite a lot of support at the time. Parliament was seen by many people as quite corrupt, but also failing on many levels. But since then, we've seen that actually it's been extended. The suspension of Parliament has continued to be suspended. But it's not just the international community has to reassure. In the lead up, you showed the journalist union. Certainly, our colleagues, journalists here in Tunisia, who have suffered, unfortunately, from police abuses. We're seeing that getting worse for journalists, that's for sure. We've had a more difficult time covering some of the demonstrations. Demonstrations themselves have had a harder time gathering because police have prevented them from gathering in downtown areas, specifically in Tunis, but certainly other areas as well, where there's been social demonstrations, social movements, and we've even seen police violence against certain journalists as well. These are all very worrying signs for freedom of expression, and it's not just the journalists and the journalist union. Other groups within Tunisia as well, other unions, other social groups, other political parties are also concerned.
Okay, Fadil, President Saied announced in the December 13th speech to the Tunisian people that the Tunisian parliament, suspended since July 25 by presidential decree, will remain suspended until legislative elections are held on December 17, 2022. Now, sincerely, are there any guarantees he will stick to the timeline?
Well, the guarantees, unfortunately, are all in the president's hands because we've seen not just his July measures, but in September he announced new measures, basically suspending large parts of the constitution and saying that his decisions couldn't be challenged by any of the courts. So when he announces that there'll be elections in the next December, really it's up to the presidency to guarantee that. There are other groups that can certainly put pressure, not just international pressure, but certainly some of the civil society groups and unions will continue to put pressure to see that elections are met at least by December, if not earlier. It's quite a long timeline. People were hoping that perhaps elections would happen a bit earlier. But the president also wants to reshape the entire political system. He says that we want to change the electoral law so that the elections will be in a different system. We might not see parliament like it used to be. He has said he really likes a direct democracy, sort of council democracy system. He's having now online consultations, asking Tunisian people to reply online. Of course, not everyone can go online, and actually it's a multiple choice questions for very, very complex questions about the political system and even economic questions. So these sort of consultation and a referendum on what the new changes will be in the lead up to those elections in December. There's a lot of question marks if these are going to be carried out, if they're going to have legitimacy. So far, we've seen not too many Tunisians participating in this process. So it's unclear without a parliament, without other serious institutions that are outside of the presidency able to really weigh in a formal means, how we're going to see this process sort of play out in a democratic way.
Fadil, in the aftermath of what his opponents have described as a constitutional coup, President Saied, as you rightly mentioned in your submission, your earlier submission, that he enjoyed broad support from a public that remains frustrated by the former government's handling of the coronavirus and the economy. What's the situation like today in Tunisia? Does it still enjoy that broad support, or is it fast eroding?
It's difficult to tell, but according to polling we've seen by different private polling groups, his popularity is starting to decrease. So where it may have been in the 80s or even 90s, according to some polling very early on July 25th, and now we're seeing those numbers closer to 60%, maybe even under 60%. And certainly people who are looking and saying they're not necessarily as optimistic as they were at July 25th. I mean, There's been 6 months. We've seen very little progress on issues that are very important to people. Early on, there was a significant improvement in the vaccination process for COVID. People were very happy about that. But on economic issues, we haven't seen much movement. He had initially said, the president, that he would try and crack down on corruption. This was a real important point of his election campaign. But also, his support as a president since then, as people have hoped that he would crack down on corruption, whether that was corruption from previous political parties that were seen as being corrupt, or whether that was from big businesses that were seen as maybe not doing their fair share during an economic crisis. But we really haven't seen much that's been produced in terms of legislation or in terms of judicial procedures. In fact, when the judiciary has been going after political parties and political figures. Some people would say that these are actually political opponents of the president. Now, it's not necessarily that they're being targeted because they're opponents, but that's certainly what people are saying and what people are thinking. And that this is the priority rather than the priority being maybe more serious crimes or more serious issues that have to do with corruption.
Now, as his popularity begins to decrease or decline among the populace, critics are saying that this is turning into a situation of authoritarianism. But President Kais said last December and announced a 3-month popular consultation with the Tunisian people via electronic and direct platforms from January 1 to March 20 in order to draft constitutional reforms based on popular propositions. How exactly is this exercise going, and what's the pulse of ordinary Tunisians on this?
Yeah, so far it's having some difficulties. We're not seeing a lot of participation. That's partly because not everyone has access to the internet, particularly in rural areas and older generation. But also, even though there are efforts to try and have state officials helping people who might have access, people who are in disenfranchised areas, who won't have access to the internet, to try and help them participate. There seems to be quite a bit of maybe cynicism or at least skepticism of the process. We've also seen, like I mentioned, some of the questions are very specific and very technical about the political system. People really are not necessarily as concerned about whether it's going to be a presidential system or a parliamentary system. I think people are really concerned about whether the system is going to work for them, whether the system is going to really deliver on their day-to-day needs and provide for people's livelihoods, in the sense of are prices going to continue to rise? Is the Tunisian currency, the dinar, continuing to lose some of its purchasing power? Will people be able to find jobs? Unemployment is still very high. We're seeing unemployment levels up to 18% and much higher for young people. So this is really at the forefront of people's concerns right now, not necessarily the political system. So at the same time, we've seen anti-corruption, transparency watchdog, iWatch, raising concerns that there's this public funding that's going into this online consultation, that there's a lot of energy and spending in this whole process, and it's actually a bit of a distraction from what really is on the minds of Tunisians, and perhaps even calling it just a political project of the president.
Thanks, Fadil. President Kais Saied is a former legal scholar, is an academician, and he once said that the constitution is not eternal. He said constitutions can be changed. He's a critic of Tunisia's 2014 post-revolutionary constitution. So what is he proposing in the new constitution? And is the 2014 constitution, in your own opinion, inadequate to meet the yearnings and aspirations of ordinary Tunisians?
It's a challenging question. I mean, he has been a lecturer for many years, decades even, at university, at the law faculty in Tunis, as to a specialization in constitution. So he has quite a lot of opinions on the constitution, which he voiced quite regularly since the 2011 revolution on national TV. speaking directly to the masses with his opinions on the Constitution. He was not happy with the 2014 Constitution. He saw it as very much a compromise, perhaps a compromise between elites, and he has his own vision for how the political system should be. In terms of what he might change in the Constitution, it's a bit unclear whether he will be taking this online consultation into account, whether this will in any way affect any decisions he might make on constitutional changes. He has said that there'll be a referendum in the summer, regardless, on any changes that take place on the political system. The most detail that we have heard on this is actually before he became president. He gave a long interview to a local paper where he said that he would like to see a direct democracy council system where perhaps a little bit like some parts of the U.S. system, some parts of a Swiss system. Some people have compared it to a Libyan system under the former Gaddafi. So there's a lot of sort of different things that are happening in his vision, but it's very clear. It's very unclear at the moment. We don't really know what that will be like, except that he has hoped that this will be one way to sort of decentralize power. He would like to see local governments have local councils that will elect to a national assembly. But what that means in practice, how that will relate to other institutions, how that will relate to the judiciary or the executive is still very unclear. We may get more details as we get closer to December. But on your last question, or your second question about the 2014 Constitution, I think there's good arguments for and against what was finally included in the 2014 Constitution. Regardless, it took quite a lot of time and debate and negotiation to get to that 2014 Constitution. It wasn't necessarily a popular one. After it was passed, there was quite a lot of celebration by the drafters themselves, by some of those who were involved in the legislation process, but it didn't have a lot of wider resonance at the time. So it was open to some criticisms, how it was drafted and its essential readings. But many people will say it's not the Constitution that's the problem. There's many other things that are much more pressing issues at the moment.
Okay, now, President Saied has repeatedly backed his claim for suspending the parliament, and in his own light, he aims to bring Tunisia to a better life. But if we look back to the euphoric days of the Arab Spring, do you think that the current political climate in Tunisia, or do you think that President Said's administration has eroded the gains in the last 1 year of the Arab Spring?
I think what we're seeing now is an accumulation of, unfortunately, a lot of deterioration in what we might consider a democratic environment in Tunisia. Even last year, we saw under the previous parliament and the previous government, before it was dismissed by President Saied, we saw a lot of, unfortunately, police violence looking to stop celebrations or demonstrations on January 14th, which is the symbolic day, the anniversary of the revolution of 2011. That was the 10-year anniversary today. This January was the 11th year anniversary. So we saw quite a lot of repression just in the last few years. And we're seeing that maybe intensifying now. So far from sort of Saied representing sort of an outlier, we're seeing him in many ways continuing what I think is many are seeing as a deterioration in some of the democratic qualities of political decision-making, political contestation in Tunisia. Many people would see what was happening in Parliament and feel like it was really disconnected from people's everyday life. Now, under a presidential system, a de facto presidential system, it is also disconnected from people's everyday life. There's very little way in which average Tunisians are going to be able to have their voices heard by those who are in power, in positions of political power, whether that's at the palace and the presidency, or whether that was in parliament. So the question now is, are things getting so bad or so much worse that there won't be any sort of point of return? Will things stick to the schedule as Saied has laid out? Will there be enthusiasm for it? Will there be faith in it? There may be some time that the president still has, some patience among people. Maybe people have seen that the last 10 years, the system that was not working for people economically and on social issues, perhaps people have a little bit of patience, even though there's still continuing crises, to maybe wait and see whether there will be results from this new era. So we'll have to see how long people's patience will last.
We'll definitely have to wait to see how things pan out. Now, Fadil, before the suspension of Tunisia's 2014 constitution in July last year and the dismissal of H.M. Mechichi's government, we saw what was happening in parliament. There were extremists on both sides. You have hardline Islamists that didn't support women's rights and all of that. And parliament, sometimes parliamentary sessions came to a brawl. You had people that didn't necessarily agree and didn't want to hear or fulfill the yearnings of ordinary Tunisians. And on the other side, you have those that are very nostalgic. They look back to the Ben Ali days and they long for those kind of things to return. Now the parliament has been suspended. We've seen how the presidential system, it's just President Kais Saied running the show. Would you say Tunisia is suffering from a hangover of long-term autocrats in government, and is the country really ready for democracy? Because, like you said earlier, when you look at it both ways, it seems the ordinary Tunisians can't really tell much of a difference.
Well, one of the problems with the last parliament was, in a sense, you could say that there was a problem of, in fact, there wasn't real governance and opposition. We didn't see so much of that. In fact, there was an avoidance of this sort of contestation. We saw that at one point there was Islamist parties and parties that considered themselves secularists who had campaigned against each other. And then as soon as the elections were done, they started working together. And that meant that, in fact, there wasn't really any difference in opinion about where the country should go. There wasn't a real debate over key issues, whether those key issues were macroeconomic issues, whether those key issues were about how to reform the public sector, how to reform the administration. In fact, people saw that these two opposing sides, the Islamist side and the secular side, when they started working together, that in fact this was just a way that in which they would avoid conflict. And by avoiding conflict, they would be sort of working to secure their own position, but not actually tackling real issues. So this sort of elite consensus, this elite pact making. Now, certainly there was violence in parliament. There was, but this was less about the two major parties. In this case, you mentioned the Islamists. There was sort of the moderate Islamists. There was a little bit hardline Islamists as well. It was sort of the populists on the fringes that didn't really fit into this Islamist secular divide that were really taking a lot of the limelight and turning parliament into a shouting match and even becoming violent. So people were certainly upset with that, but they were also upset with the lack of results that we saw because some of these parties really wouldn't put forward a political vision. There wasn't a lot of courage to put forward a real plan about where to go from here for Tunisia. There was a lot of people really just saying these parties are really trading seats and trading horses, but not necessarily thinking about what the future should hold.
Now, Fadil, if you would agree with me, it's more of a ploy, or rather Kais Saied's move was more of a ploy to remove the Ennahda party, which, as you rightly said, was more of Islamic ideologies. Now, with the institution of a new prime minister in October, we saw the first female prime minister appointed by Kais Saied, which is Najla Boudin. But critics would say that she had little or no experience in government.
An outsider.
Yes, a geologist, an outsider. Do you think this new prime minister would really make an impact in making the economic gains of the country grow?
It's a good question. So far, Saied, he himself has considered himself an outsider, and he has brought in other outsiders. These outsiders are actually, most of them are in academia. So he has come from the university, and I believe it's almost 2/3 of the current government have also been in academia in universities. So these are the people that perhaps he has felt most comfortable with. It's more difficult to sort of ascertain what their political ideologies or their political leanings are. It's a good question, certainly about experience. I think there are people who have pointed to the new government whether they have experience. And particularly the prime minister, but there was also people who were celebrating the fact that this is the first female prime minister, not just in Tunisia but in the region. Others who said, well, that's a bit of tokenism. So there was a good debate over whether this was in fact a choice that made sense. But I think the more sort of interesting critique that we saw was also the fact that she may not actually have that much power. So this is a prime minister who was appointed by the president at a time when the president has severely curtailed the powers of the prime minister and other ministries. So ministries all have to go through the presidency these days, and that's what we're seeing in the last few months, which some people may enjoy. You mentioned a sort of nostalgia for the old regime, for the old Ben Ali regime, a presidential system where really one person manages to cut through red tape. At the same time, there may be real challenges to having everything bottlenecked through the presidency, or having the presidency have too much power over decisions, whether that's in the judiciary, a balance of power. So there's really two ways to look at it as well, and certainly we're in an unprecedented moment where we're really trying to still sort of wait and see how exactly is the system working, or is it working at all.
Now, Fadil, before we wrap things up, Tunisia has always been described as the only successful revolution in the Arab Spring. It's the birthplace of the Arab Spring. Now, how can the revolution of justice and dignity achieve the demands of which hundreds of young people sacrificed their lives? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
It's a very difficult question. I think it's a question that's still contested to this day. Certainly the people who went out in 2011, who put their bodies on the line to bring down the previous government, and hundreds of people were killed or injured at that time. For them, I think there's quite a lot that in the last 10 years has not succeeded. And I think they've still been pushing for it. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the families of those people who were injured or killed in 2011, every year at the anniversary of the revolution, they come down to downtown Tunis and demonstrate. And they're still demonstrating oftentimes for the same demands that their family members were demonstrating for then, which is they would like to see a state that works for them, that takes care of them, that makes sure that there's opportunities for them, whether that's economically, whether that's in terms of health services, whether that's in terms of transportation, that this is really the organs of the state, the institutions of the state are serving them. And so far, we haven't seen that. We've seen that people have become increasingly frustrated with that, whether that's increasing frustration with parliament or elections. Now we may see increasing frustration with the alternative to that. The alternative to that being a presidential system that is trying to change to an entirely different decentralized system. It's certainly not something that one person has the answer for. I think it's something that's collectively sort of argued with and contested over between different groups. But certainly, I think that the questions of 2011 over what the revolution will look like, what a really fair and just society will look like, that certainly has not been, the book has not been closed on that. That's still an open debate.
We'll definitely keep our eyes on events in Tunisia, and we wish Tunisians the best in getting
I mean, even though they gave Nigeria 1 million, it's so good to have you join us on the conversation.
Congratulations to the Carthage Eagles. It was the battle of the Eagles yesterday. Carthage Eagles versus Super Eagles of Nigeria, and your country emerged victorious. So congratulations to you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Fadil Alizera, for joining us on the conversation. We look forward to having you back some other time.
Thank you very much.
So we'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be discussing the Senegal elections. Do stay tuned.
You're welcome back to the conversation. To Senegal now, where over 6 million Senegalese, around a third of the population, are eligible to cast votes for the mayors of more than 500 town halls, as well as the heads of 40 administrative areas known as departments. The local elections will determine who leads Dakar, the country's capital city, which has remained an opposition stronghold since 2009.
Now, the city is fiercely contested because it houses a quarter of the country's population, produces 55% of the national GDP, and generates 80% of the country's employment opportunities.
Now, join us now to discuss this is Abdulatif Ahmed, is the head of research and monitoring at New Central Television. Thanks for joining us on the conversation, Abdulatif.
Thank you for having me.
Abdulatif, Senegal is made up of 14 regions, which are subdivided into departments. For the divided into municipal communes, the election code establishes that both departmental and communal level municipal councils are elected under two parallel electoral systems. Can you further explain this electoral system in Senegal, especially how the majoritarian and proportional system works?
It's on record that Senegal has had successful elections, about 11 successful elections and transitions since its independence. It runs a semi-presidential system where the legislative arm is very independent, even though it is seen as weak. But the judiciary is seen as very robust, and the executive arm has been able to work through things with other arms of government. People are free to vote for who they want to vote, and it is seen as one of the best in the region, and that is why transition has been smooth since the inception of democracy in the country.
Okay, now before we go into the elections, let's look at how Senegal is coping. Senegal is one of the few African states that has never experienced a coup d'etat, but recently it has been classified as backsliding from a fully free to a partially free regime. Why do you think this is so?
There is a chance that those who are in power sometimes want to arrogate to themselves totalitarian powers. In that regard, you remember, for example, the last elections that held where Ousmane Sonko was contesting against the current president of the country. There were a lot of concerns, and essentially because there was a change in the constitution for which there are fears that the current president may seek a third term. And so a lot of political overreaching from those who are in positions of power. And that is why a lot of persons in the country have continued to become, although trust the system, but getting more dissatisfied, because in spite of how much progress the country has made, it is riddled with a lot of poverty.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned Ousmane Sonko, and law students would agree with me that AV Dice's principle of separation of powers. But if you look at what is going on in Senegal today, there have been accusations of repeated interference in the judiciary to ensure prosecutions of popular opposition leaders. President Macky Sall has been accused of using the judiciary, for example, to go after opposition government minister Karim Wade, former Dakar Mayor Khalifa Sall, who is no relative of the president, and parliamentarian Ousmane Sonko. How does interference of the executive in judiciary matters downgrade the level of democracy in Senegal?
It does, because the only way the system can be trusted is when people believe that their grievances can be sorted out by the various arms of government, so that when people have genuine concerns, genuine worries for which they feel that the judiciary should adjudicate, it is something of concern or worry that the president interferes with the process, because the process is as important as the outcome. So people will rather, the citizens will rather, the president understands that there is separation of power, there is zero need for him to interfere in the process, and whatever the outcome is should be respected, because that is what makes for a robust system. So people have seen over time that the president, wanting to perpetuate himself in office, has tried to be in between, himself and the law, and that is a thing of serious concern.
Okay, now looking at these elections as the first one we have in Africa for this year, being an election here. Now, aside holding importance in terms of local access to resources, why do you think these local elections are so important in Senegal?
So in Senegal, local elections are some sort of barometers. They create a feel of what the political current is like in the country. So that when you have strategic states like Dakar and Ziguinchor, for example, the outcomes of elections in these places gives a sense of the overall feel across the country. Most of the outcome of the local government election gives an insight to what will happen in the next few months, because elections like these, political parties put in their very best to ensure that they win as much as they can. And so it is very important to see that whatever happens in these elections may be a pointer as to what will happen in the next few months.
Now, Senegal is a big part of ECOWAS and in the West African sub-region. There's been talks of Macky Sall altering the constitution to allow him to go for a third term. It's not the first time we've seen this in West Africa. It happened in Guinea with President Alpha Condé. It happened in neighboring Ivory Coast with Alassane Ouattara, and also in Burkina Faso before he was kicked out with Blaise Compaoré. Is it too early? Elections are next year. Is there any truth to this? Like they always say in this past, there's no smoke without a fire.
The president came in, Macky Sall came in 2012, and going by what the Constitution allows for, it is 4 years of every term. And by that, it means that at the end of 2 terms, he should be concluding his tenure by 2020. However, because of the constitutional alteration or constitutional amendment in 2016, it is assumed that he should run for another term in office, for which he will not be eligible to contest for the next election. However, depending on the direction of the parliament, we are not sure yet if he is going to contest or not. But like they say, a lot of presidents in position of power would rather stay longer in office than step aside, be gentlemanly enough to leave when the ovation is high. So there are fears and there are concerns, and so that if he has to contest again for the third term, he will have stayed probably the longest, one of the longest in power.
But Latif, why do we see this problem of third-termism in African politics?
I'll reduce it to the fact that there is no equitable distribution of wealth and resources and positioning of people across board. If public officers or if political appointed persons have done their assignments, if they've done their own part of the deal, there will be no worry as to what direction the country proceeds when they leave power. However, most of them, most of the time, do not prepare for exit. They only come in hoping to last as long as they can. They do not think anybody can do it better than they can. And it begins to create disaffection and apathy in the system. It begins to create sometimes mutiny in the army, as the case may be, because things begin to remain as they were when the president came in, and people want some air of freshness.
Okay, Abdulatif, let's look at the electoral body now. We know that these elections were delayed 3 times since 2019, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of people were anticipating these local elections. But now the independence of the National Autonomous Electoral Commission, that is SENA, which oversees all municipal elections, has been on the question. And this is so because we know that all its members are being appointed by the president. So how do you think, or how credible would you rate this electoral body and electoral process in Senegal when the president is the one in charge of putting this, the members of the electoral body?
Well, that is a problem of the Constitution. If that is what the Constitution says, there is nothing one can do except it is corrected. There's an assumption that a president will give a level playing field for everybody who is contesting in the elections. However, if he is an interested party in the election, it is most likely that he'll select persons who are amenable to what he wants or what he intends to achieve. With the way things are, what the people of Senegal can do is to remain eternally vigilant to ensure that as they cast their votes, they ensure they monitor the process so that there will be no dribbles, midway in the game.
Now, these local elections were postponed multiple times since they were originally scheduled in June 2019. Did the electoral body meet up expectations in terms of conducting these elections?
So the electoral body has given reasons for which elections were being postponed. There were concerns over security. There were concerns over modalities of the election. There were even concerns about the pandemic. However, the fact that the elections will be holding soon, the fact that there is a rollout of the modalities of the election shows that there is not need for speed. You'll rather have things go slow and get it right than go fast and crash. I think they're doing whatever they think they must do to get it right, in spite of the delays.
Okay. And there was a lot of anticipation yesterday when we had the local elections. Let's have a feel of what happened at the polling units in Senegal.
Je suis venu voter parce que c'est un droit civique que je devais accomplir et pour faire vivre la démocratie aussi. C'est tout.
C'était très important que je vienne accomplir mon devoir parce qu'on parle de la commune. Donc c'est à nous de choisir quelqu'un qui est prêt à travailler pour la commune, quelqu'un qui est prêt à nous accompagner durant ces 5 ans.
Vraiment fier de venir participer à ces élections. Les gens sont là en train de voter, les partis sont là, donc ça fait un bon temps. Je suis vraiment content. Et je lance un appel à mes amis qui sont dans la maison aussi de venir voter. Voilà, de venir voter massivement. Alors, pour vraiment ça, les votes locaux, c'est très important.
Je suis content d'avoir voté parce que c'est un acte de citoyenneté. Et puis c'est à nous d'élire les maires pour avoir une commune propre et bien entretenue.
Now, from the video clip we saw there, we saw a lot of Senegalese coming out at the polls and anticipating the local elections. Now, Abdulatif, how would you rate the level of voter participation in these local elections? In most African countries, we see voter apathy. But in these videos, we see them coming out to say they want to cast their vote. So how would you rate voter participation?
It's been impressive considering the fact that a lot of Senegalese are very politically active and they come out en masse to vote when need arises. They understand, for example, that the municipal elections are for people who represent them and are closest to them. While a lot of people will focus on who becomes the president of the country, those who are closest to them, those who are more accessible to them, are those within the municipals. And so when you look at the outcomes of the elections, for example, the fact that 2 strategic states were lost by the ruling party, that is Dakar itself and one of the southwest states, you realize that in spite of the government's intent to be in charge, there is a general understanding that there's need to offer space for opposition parties. And that is why this is an impressive election. And there has been no irregularities, reported cases of violence and stuff like that.
Okay, Abdulatif, the mayoral candidates were expected to pay up to 15 million CFA francs. That's roughly $25,000. It's a huge amount of money to pay to be able to participate in elections for somebody that is seeking an active office. Do you think Senegalese politics has been monetized, and what are the effects of this paying such a huge amount of money just for nomination form?
So we expect that by now electoral processes and electioneering will have become more digitized and more advanced in most part of African countries. But when you look at the worries and concerns in Senegal, for example, you realize that one of those issues are the process that ensures that certain people are rigged out of electioneering. For instance, if you charge that much for people who are contesting for elections, what it means is that there are certain components of the society that will never be able to contest for elections, or that will have to rely on financiers who would rather have their say on what such a person does when he comes into power. So it is a problem for most West African countries, or most African countries, where people have to pay so much to get the forms, nomination forms, to emerge as candidates, and then run elections for which they emerge or they lose. And then there is a general decline in governance, because when you have to pay so much to acquire a political position, there will need to be a time for you to recoup whatever you have.
It's almost like
in.
a business deal.
Exactly. Yeah. So it therefore goes away from focusing on the masses and more on the persons who emerge in office. So that's the problem around electioneering, mostly in most part of Africa.
Thank you very much, Abdulateef, for being a part of the conversation today. We do appreciate your insights on the subject.
Thank you for having me.
And Rita, so much happening on the continent. We're monitoring the polls in Burkina Faso. The United States is threatening Sudan with sanctions, and of course, the Malian situation is still there.
It's still
so
ongoing,
much
so much. And in Burkina Faso, our eyes are really there to see what's going to happen. Is ECOWAS going to intervene in this attempted coup that's going on in Burkina Faso? And of course, we'll shed more light on it and secure the continent on Thursday. And of course, on Wednesday, we'll also be looking at an attempted coup in Burkina Faso. This is where we'll draw the curtains for today's edition of The Conversation. I am Rita Omodia.
And I'm Gbenga, Aborowa. See you next time on The Conversation.